Hi, I'm Susanna and this is my April reading wrap-up. I finished 2 novels in April. Let's start with Ruthless Vows by Rebecca Ross. This is the second book in Rebecca Ross's young adult fantasy duology Letters of Enchantment. I read the first book, Divine Rivals, in March and reviewed it in my previous wrap-up video. Iris Vino has returned home without her husband, Roman Kidd. Her hometown, Oath, continues to live in denial, unconcerned of the war between gods, waging closer and closer to the city. When Iris is given the chance to return to the front, she once again heads westward despite the danger, determined to tell the truth of the war and to find Roman. On the other side of the enemy lines, Roman wakes up, healed by god Dacre, but with no memories. He begins to work as a war correspondent for Dacre, but when a letter arrives beneath his wardrobe door, he is once again drawn to his mysterious pen ball. Ruthless Vows picks up a few weeks after the events of the first book. Iris and Roman are separated and they need to find their way back together and to end the war between gods. There's less romance and more fantasy war plot in this novel than in Divine Rivals. We also get a lot more scenes and chapters from Roman's point of view. Personally, I would have preferred to see more scenes from Iris's point of view, and that was one of the reasons I didn't like this book as much as Divine Rivals. The second reason why I'm giving this book a slightly lower rating than the first book is the relationship between the main characters. I loved the slow burn of the first book, but as their relationship was consummated already at the end of Divine Rivals, there was little that could happen for them in this book to further their relationship. We actually take a step backward because Roman needs to regain his memory and fall in love with Iris again. That, combined with the fact that they were apart for the majority of the novel, meant that their relationship didn't have the opportunity to grow and mature. And that meant that at some point I began to doubt their continual avowals that they were in love. They barely knew each other and their relationship seemed to be based purely on lust and obsession. And finally, there were a lot of small plot holes in this book. Nothing major, but little things like how and where the characters got certain information. For example, how did Iris know what Roman was doing with Dacre? I suppose she might have learned it from a letter that simply wasn't shared on page, but I would have preferred some mention of those letters and their contents. Also, when Roman and Iris finally do meet, why does Roman stay back? His decision to become a sort of double agent is never explicitly explained on page. As it is, it seemed nothing more than a convenient plot device to keep the main characters apart. Most of these plot holes could have been explained by just a few extra lines, and the fact that they aren't makes it seem that the publication process of this book may have been a little rushed. If romance is what you mainly want and you aren't interested in fantasy war plot, you'll probably enjoy this book less than Divine Rivals. I didn't think Ruthless Vows was quite as good as the first book, but I still enjoyed it a lot, so I'm giving this 4 stars. The second book I finished in April is Tomorrow and Tomorrow and Tomorrow by Gabrielle Zevin. This is a literary fiction. On a cold December day of his junior year at Harvard, Sam Masur sees his childhood friend Sadie Green at a crowded train station and calls her name. Their reunion sets off a collaboration that launches them to fame and leads to a decades-long tale of friendship and rivalry. The story follows the 2 main characters Sam and Sadie from their childhood in the 1980s when they meet and bond while playing video games, to the 1990s and the early 2000s when they start a company that produces video games, some of them huge successes, others not so much. Let me start by saying that my favorite genres are historical fiction, fantasy, and dystopian fiction, so basically stories that do not take place in our contemporary world. However, every now and then I want to branch out and try something different, like an occasional literary fiction. Sometimes it pays off, other times not so much. Unfortunately, this was one of those times when I was slightly disappointed. My biggest problem with this book was the narration style. Zevin uses an omniscient third-person narrator who occasionally tells little spoilers of future events. Now, I don't always mind that type of narrator. In fact, I love the spoilery narrator of Marcus Zusak's The Book Thief. However, this time I felt the narration kept me at an arm's length from the characters and made it difficult for me to care about them. So much so that when a character in this book dies, I did not cry a single tear. And I cry at everything, even at books that I don't particularly like. I'm also not a gamer, so I don't know much about the games Sam and Sadie grew up with. It was interesting to learn about the video game industry and how the games are made, but it wasn't enough to make me love the book. I also wasn't a fan of how all of Sam's and Sadie's problems were the result of a miscommunication trope. They both refused to say what they meant and to be open about their feelings. However, Tomorrow and Tomorrow and Tomorrow is one of those books where I can see how someone else might love this. So even though due to my own lack of enjoyment I'm only giving this book 3 stars, I can recommend it to someone who loves literary fiction tackling the themes of love, friendship and betrayal. I also finished a few non-fiction books in April. 5 of them were about the ancient Greek novels. And I also finally finished this massive psychology handbook in Finnish. I'm currently in the middle of The Battle Drum by Sara El Arifi. This is the second book in her fantasy trilogy, The Ending Fire. I read the first book, The Final Strife, last year. After I finish this book, I'm going to read the third and final book in the trilogy, The Ending Fire. In May, I'm also rereading The Hunger Games by Suzanne Collins. And I want to start God Killer by Hannah Gaynor. There's also 2 non-fiction books that I'm currently in the middle of. Backlash, The Undeclared War Against Women by Susan Faludi. And Bullshit Jobs by David Graeber. Those were all of the books I read in April and my goals for May. Let me know in the comments what your favorite book in April was, and I'll see you in my next video.